Okay, so perfect. So we'll be jumping straight into today's lesson and then we'll see if anyone else shows up. But basically, the overview for today is we're going to be going more into the introduction of prose. We're going to be going over the homework a little, and then we're going to be looking at a sample of prose and then kind of finishing off with a free write. So kind of a similar structure like what we did last time. So before we get into the homework, I just want to ask if you had any like comments or questions or concerns about the homework, or like how did you feel about the homework? Hi, Ali. We're just getting started. Um, yeah, so does anyone have anything to share about kind of how the homework went or how do you feel about the homework?
I think the homework was pretty difficult.
Pretty difficult. Is there a specific part you thought was difficult? I know the poems are like pretty dense.
For one thing, I had a little bit of trouble coming up coming up with a bunch of topics to write about, mostly being just stuff that interests me.
Yeah. Yeah, I know I can it can be hard to like analyze poems, but I think it's hopefully good you
Mhm.
guys got a little more practice. So that's great. And I looked over a lot of people's submissions and I didn't get to grade all of them, but I kind of got a chance to read through some of them. And I noticed like a lot of people kind of thought that the reading was a little confusing. And I think that's definitely very normal, especially when you're kind of getting into poetry. I think someone also mentioned that like the vibe, so some of the poems didn't really vibe for them. But one of them did. And I think that's really telling because sometimes you won't be able to find the poem that resonates with you until you're kind of developed or discovered your own writing style. So, or your reading style. And I think it's like really good time when your writing st style starts to develop and you begin to think like, oh, like I finally get why I love this specific piece. Okay. I first didn't understand the poem, then I searched it up and I learned what it's about. Yeah. I think searching it up can be a really good way to see other people's perspectives on the poem as well. So that's definitely a good thing to do. Um, Yeah, so that's pretty good. I feel like for me, when I first started writing poetry, it felt kind of like this, kind of how you guys feel. And it seems kind of dumb because, and then you read something that is just like really incredible to you, and then you feel like you're the one who's like behind. But I feel like the reading is it's kind of dense. It's not dense like William Faulkner, but every sentence is kind of very packed with like almost an obscure meaning. But it's a really interesting style to kind of sit with. So. It's okay if poetry isn't your thing so much though, because today we'll be getting into prose. Um, so do one of you guys want to read the definition of prose on the slide?
Me?
Okay, you can go.
Generally, anything that is not poetry is prose.
Yep, you can keep.
Specifically, anything that doesn't use material structure, e.g., iambic pentameter. Types of prose will focus on flash fiction, memoir, short story.
Yep. Okay, so prose is essentially anything that isn't poetry.
Mhm.
And that kind of makes prose a really broad category. But there are lots of genres within prose. And I know some of you might like sci-fi or fantasy. But unfortunately in this class we won't really be covering sci-fi so much or like speculative fiction. But if you're really interested in stuff like that, I can always send you opportunities or workshops. I can try to weave that into some workshops and specifically focus on that type of writing. So are you interested in sci-fi more so than other types of fiction, or do you think it's fine to just stick with fiction?
I don't think it's completely fine to stick with fiction.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, so in this class, we'll be focusing more on like flash fiction, memoir, short stories, and then those are also kind of categories within the Scholastic writing competition if you guys are interested in that. And we probably won't be going into novels, humor, dystopia, but if there are popular requests for that, again, like I'll try to touch on it in a lesson. Okay, so what are the fundamentals of prose? So we'll be going through kind of a bit like a lecture format with some questions I'll sprinkle throughout. So I want you guys to try to answer at least one or two of them. And then the main concepts we'll be looking at today are plot and economy. show, don't tell, and what I like to call cultivated complexity. So the last one is kind of referred to by many different names, but let's just dive in. So, what is the most basic structure of plot that you guys know? Like, do you guys know any specific things that you've touched on in class?
Mhm.
Like, do your teachers talk about Plot Mountain? Have you heard of that? A little bit? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me see if I can annotate. So plot mountain kind of is like this. If you see what I'm drawing on this slide, that's
Hmm.
basically like the general shape of plot mountain. You have your like exposition here, and then you have your rising action, then your little climax. And then down here, I think you have your following action, and then your resolution. So that kind of like levels off. So that's your basic structure of plot mountain. And it definitely like works for some stories, but the point is it's kind of very rigid. And also another style you might have heard of is like the hero's journey, which is basically a more complicated version of plot mountain, and it has like more of like a 12-step process. Um, but yeah, we've seen Plot Mountain a lot of times, right? And the basic story is just beginning, exposition, rising action, climax. And this is a really great way to start out, but it gives you kind of a way to think about plot. And as we move on to learning more about writing and the idea of diagramming out a story can really help us think about writing if we're thinking about it in theoretical terms. Um, and there's a really great article that I'm sad I kind of lost, but it has a bunch of these types of plot diagrams. But they're all creative and different, like the ones we'll see. And there's one that looks like there's really different types of shapes. I don't really remember or can't really draw each one, but there's just a lot of different really cool ones. And if I find them one day, I'll try to show you guys. But the main reason we aren't going to be focusing on Plot Mountain in this class is that number one, you guys have already learned about it a lot in class, I'm assuming. And then number two is that Plot Mountain is very rigid. So it you can't really change the structure. There's no room for like kind of a plot twist here or something else like that. And number two is it's like plot focused, right? So I'd like you guys to think about what does it mean to have a story driven by your plot versus a story driven by character. Mm. Alvin, do you want to answer? Like plot focused versus character focused. Do you guys have any idea? Okay, so basically, if you guys don't know what the difference is, um, okay, you guys don't know. Okay, that's completely fine. So basically, a story that's driven by plot, you base everything off the plot. So that really leaves little room for the change of the character. Or more specifically, the plot isn't based on the character and their growth, right? So there are three main structures that we'll be using instead of like Plot Mountain. And these don't come from me, they come from Ashley Shue, who's a three-time Scholastic Gold medalist, which, if you think about it, that's kind of like the top 1% of people, and she did it three times, so that's really impressive. But basically, she says how you should think about stories is to make them character centric. So what that means is focus on the characters. And you can see up here, I have character one and character A and character B. So this first one is when they're like converging. So the two characters come together towards the end of the story and they're driven by the plot and ideas. So that's this first type of kind of character-centric plot or a story. And then the second one is character A and character B. They kind of start together, right? And then they diverge outwards. So this is diverging. And this is when characters start together and then they drift apart. And then circular is kind of when they start and end in the same place. So some things might change. The arrow could go outside the circle a little. But otherwise, it's a very circular structure. So the characters are kind of repeating their mistakes or they're living the same way. And then the story is an observation of the kind of stagnancy and constant situation that they're in. So another thing I want you guys to think about is that the structure doesn't have to be two characters, right? It can be a character and it could be their concept of an identity. So there's one story that we'll see soon in an example that's called Yellow by Matt Su, an American Gold Key winner. And the story is a diverging story. So instead of two characters diverging, it's a character and his favorite color. So basically, it's like him and his identity are diverging because the color serves as a reflection, as a metaphor for his Asian identity. So that's why the story is kind of called Yellow because there's a connection there. So the plot is really important. And while we're writing, instead of thinking about plot mountain, I want you guys to think about how we can create these kind of character-centric stories with these structures shown on the screen. Let me see if I can exit out annotating. Okay. Oh no, I have to erase all these drawings. Um, Let me quickly erase them. Okay. So now we're going to talk about economy and singular concepts. So does anyone know what it means to be economical? Just any guesses if you've heard the word used in your everyday life?
Mm, the only thing that I heard anything about economical about is in my social studies class about how people make and spend money.
Yeah, money. Money is definitely a way that it's being used. Um, Alvin, do you have any ideas what it means? When you manage money well. Yeah. So that's pretty good. Like I would say Scrooge McDuck, he's a very economical guy. Or if your parents are trying to save a bunch of money, they're very economical. So what does that word mean though? So like outside of money, someone can be economical with their time, they can be economical with their spendings or savings. They're like saving anything. So if you've ever seen your parents save the weirdest things like H Mart bags, that's like that's when they're trying to be economical, right? And when we're writing our stories, it's also really important to be economical. So economical is basically like you're being very attentive to how you're using space. So every single word, every single little word that you use is something that the audience is going to notice. So every little symbol you use is something the audience is going to notice. And this is a philosophy for especially thinking about flash fiction and short stories specifically. And it might not matter so much in terms of like a grand scheme, like a novel, but when you're thinking about a flash fiction piece or a short story piece, it's the economy that counts, right? And that's whether it's word economy, which is the idea that every word or word choice will count towards implying something, or even the idea of singular concepts. So you should not be greedy when you're trying to write about flash fiction or short story, and make sure you're focusing on capturing one idea at a time. So there can be smaller ideas that tie into a singular concept, but you'll choose one story idea. And then maybe you could have like a twist, but you don't want it to be like the main character is going on a quest and they're trying to date someone and they're not, and then they're trying to rescue their school and then they got recruited as a model and then they're being followed by, wolves and vampires and the vampires are battling. That's a very bad story, right? Because you want to be resourceful with your stories. You don't want to just kind of go all over the place and then there's no main theme. So that's kind of what we talked about last class about cohesiveness. So you want to make sure that you have a single plot or a single idea to really focus on. And then one example that I think is really excellent, and we'll either get to it for homework or for the reading in our class today. The whole story is basically centered around a moment where the character's mother steals a pack of gum. And then that is literally one of the best scholastic stories I've ever read. And it's like the best example of everything that a flash fiction piece should be. So that's a side note, and we might see that later. But um, Okay, finally, story item. So this is basically your shortcut to making a very deep and metaphorical piece. So you want to choose 1 to 2 literal objects that actually follow your character throughout the piece. Um, can anyone guess why it's important to have like actual objects instead of like kind of abstract ideas like love, death, whatever? Why is it important to have like a specific object? You can just like throw anything out there.
Don't know.
Don't know? Any guesses? Because it can change throughout the story. That's like a good guess. Yeah. But look at like the slide. We're talking about singular concepts, right? So why is it better to have like something kind of small, rather than just like love? This is a pretty tough question. Okay. That's okay. So if we're thinking about it in kind of concrete, literal terms, so let's say I'm using a bottle of lotion as a metaphor for beauty or something like that. If I'm just talking about beauty, then there's nothing for my readers to really think about when they're thinking about like my ideas on beauty. But if I say like, oh, this lotion is pretty on the outside but ugly on the inside, and then they have like an idea that kind of shows them or gives them an idea of what I mean by beauty, right? And as someone says in the chat, it's easier to think about themes when you're thinking about an object rather than something big. So this actually leads us to one of our rules about singular concepts and story items, and that's basically the meaningless object. So this is kind of clickbaity, but the idea is that the more meaningless or the more detailed something is, the more you're actually attaching your readers to it. So I think that's pretty easy to see being played out in real life. So you can like, are you remembering someone's dress or are you remembering someone's glittery slip-on dress colored pearlescent turquoise pink like ocean waves, right? You're probably remembering the second one because it's very detailed, right? And there's really specific things. Unless it's too much detail, then you can't remember any of it. But the idea is that the more detailed something is, the more you're attaching your reader to it. And then that's because it's unique to you and your story, right? If like for example going back to the dress example, if you just talk about a dress, so many stories include dresses, but if you have a specific type, super hyper specific type of dress, that's really unique to you and your story. So let's look at this example. Does anyone want to read the first bullet point? The yellow is my favorite color. Allie, do you want to read it?
No.
No. Oh, okay. Alvin, do you want to read it? Oh, okay. I guess I'll read it. Basically, the first part says, yellow is my favorite color. I used it everywhere I drew. And then let's look at the second bullet, which is basically like a better upgraded version of that. And then this one says, yellow gurgled all along my drawings, from the quarter pie sun in the corner of the page to the onion ring bumblebees with foot-long stingers to the misshapen chunks of Swiss cheese I held in my palm like an Italian waiter. So which one do you guys think is more specific, the first one or the second one?
Second.
Second, yeah. So, what parts of this description do you think really make that detailed? Like, which parts are really detailed and kind of fulfill that meaningless object specificity kind of rule? Just point out some things you notice. Do you guys notice anything?
Not really.
You don't notice anything specific about the way it's described? Any like specific things that are mentioned?
Well, there's a lot of specificity for what that guy drew.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, he mentions like the quarter pie sun, the onion ring bumblebees with foot-long stingers, right? And that repetition of the dash makes it really fun. And then the misshapen chunks of Swiss cheese, they go into all the detail they can, right? They don't just say cheese, they don't just say Swiss cheese, they say the misshapen chunks of Swiss cheese, right? So they've literally tried to add as much detail as they can. And then as I held in my palm like an Italian waiter, that's so detailed, right? That's even more detailed. So that's kind of an example of the singular concepts rule and basically just making something very specific so it's unique to you and your story so your reader can attach it to you. So now I want you guys to try to practice rewriting and try to practice this singular concept idea. So I want you guys to rewrite the sentence, we did many fun and interesting things on Chinese New Year. And you can just write like one or two sentences, but how can you guys really rewrite that to make it more specific and more memorable? Because no one's going to remember a sentence if it's just like we did fun things, right? They're going to remember it if you add detail. So I'll give you guys about 2 minutes to kind of rewrite that sentence and make it better. Do you guys have any questions? You can just write it in the chat. Okay. Okay, you guys have 50 more seconds.
Okay, finished.
Just in time. Okay. All right. Do you want to read yours first and then we can look at Alvin's in the chat?
I already looked at all this in the chat.
Me too. But do you want to read yours?
Mm, no thanks.
Okay. Let's look at Alvin's. Okay. During Chinese New Year, we participated in a variety of
Mm,
very fun, exciting, meaningful, and culturally interesting activities that made the event special. Okay, yeah, that's definitely very way more detailed than my example. But just like I try to add in very specific things that are unique to your kind of experience or very unique, specific things that you can think of. So I noticed you say like culturally interesting activities. But again, like try to hone into one like specific activity you did, or if there's one specific object that kind of reminds you of one activity you did. Um, Basically try to steer away from like generalized descriptions of like activities and try to hone in on something concrete. Um, and then let me think, try to see if I can think of like a better example. Um, Yeah, you could talk about like if you've been like drawing butterflies, for example, for like a parade or kind of doing paper cutting. That's like a very specific thing, right? A specific action rather than just kind of calling a less specific or more general description. So basically focus on one concrete object like you can hold in your hand or one specific activity. But yeah, so that's kind of the idea of singular concept and the meaningless object. And I hope you guys kind of get that or understand that more because it's a really important concept that will show up all throughout good writing. So, okay, now let's move on to show don't tell. So I'm going to go over this kind of quickly because it's kind of basic, but you want to show the characters and show how they feel by um, through their actions, right? So you want to show making sure that their actions can convey emotions. And if we think about this in real life and we're thinking about character-driven stories, people don't talk like I'm mad, I'm going to ruin your life, right? They will act mad, they'll break something, they'll talk very quietly or they'll talk very loudly depending on the type of person and how they're mad, but they won't just be like, I'm mad, right? And then another reason you should always try to show through actions and not just state things is because actions kind of add ambiguity. So, do you guys know what ambiguity means? So ambiguity basically, no, okay. Ambiguity basically means like there's room for different interpretations of things. So it's not like this is the answer. It's like it could be interpreted in different ways. So if you have someone say, I hate you and you're horrible, and it's not in a moment where, for example, you have an angsty character who says to their parents and then they regret it. If you're just saying that in a very serious way, then it kind of simplifies what the story could be, right? It tells your reader, oh, this is a story about someone who hates their parents or their dog or something like that, right? And that's not really fun. Um, so the rule I'd go by when kind of you're checking for show and tell is you don't always need to do it, right? In fact, for me as a writer, I think the problem is I show too much and then I assume that people will know what I'm saying. And then if they don't, it gets kind of confusing. But in general, I'd say you can use um, as a good check for revising, you can look at a sentence, and if you're looking at it and a character is saying like, um, Janet was very mad today. Janet walked into her room and turned off the lights and cried. You check, am I showing this emotion? And am I narrating this in a way that a real person would narrate their feelings? And then in that case, it would be no. So that's a good way to kind of check to make sure, and make your story better when you're doing revision. Just make sure you're kind of balancing show don't tell as well. I think there are some parts where, like before, when you're setting the scene, exposition, that's a good place to more so tell than show because if you're showing everything, then it could be a little too much. But for the important parts, when you want to kind of add ambiguity and make sure that your reader is kind of showing an emotion, you should make sure that you're not just outrightly saying and telling the reader what to think. You should show it through the character's actions. Okay, and then now we're going to move on to cultivated complexity. So when we're thinking about cultivated complexity, it's based on the idea that there are no good or evil forces in life. So as such, you should reflect on similar elements in your own stories. So there are definitely exceptions, and we won't get to them in our class, but there are definitely things that are like, you're evil, you're good. But what we want to capture in our writing and in our stories isn't those very harsh black and white aspects of life. You want to capture the gray area. So these are the areas of the stories that are the most interesting. So what you want to write are characters that are not just good or not just bad, but they're justifiable. So that means that you're creating characters that could exist outside of a world, outside in a world around you, right? Outside of your story, because they're shaped by factors outside of your story. So you don't want to have a character that's just confined to their world by what you see, right? And then that's kind of why I use a forest metaphor. So you only see a few things in the forest, but then you recognize that there is a forest around you, right? And there's so much more to the world of the story, and you only get to see a glimpse of it in your story. So you kind of want to keep in mind the importance of motive and identity. So does any one of you guys know what a motive is? The goal, yeah, the goal.
The
Allie, do you have?
the cause for doing something.
Mhm. Yeah, so it's a reason someone does something, it's a goal. So if you're reading like a murder mystery, for example, someone will have a motive for the murder, hopefully, unless they're like a psychopath or something. But a motive in real life is like, why is someone acting that way? For example, tiger parents. I don't know if you guys have, do you guys know what the term tiger parents are or is?
Parents who easily get mad and stuff.
Kind of, not quite. It's like, yeah, very strict parents. So tiger parents are, there's like a book called Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, and it's basically like a Chinese parent, not necessarily have to be Chinese, but a lot of the stereotype is that they're Chinese and they really want their kid, or like very strict on their kid to do certain things. And then yeah, you'll see them written about a lot. And the stereotype is kind of like the character is very cold, and they're doing this out of motive, but they're doing this out of the motive of making something better for their children, right? So there's that motive that makes their actions justifiable. They might seem like they're very strict, but ultimately they're doing this to give a better life to their children. So, um, here's an example on the bottom from Ashley Shu's Third Body Problem, which was the recipient of a gold medal and American Voices Award. So that's really hard to get. And then it says, to her parents' interrogation, I just added an excerpt, but I'll try to see if I can show you guys what I mean. Um, so it says, to her parents' interrogation, shaming her over the impossibility of divorce, and how could she do this to you, she told you, bring you up in a broken family. So this story is basically about a family that is not super healthy, but you can see that the mom's motivation for not leaving is that she doesn't want to have a divorce, not only because there's kind of shame of that in her culture, but also because she wanted to raise her children to the best that her child could be and in a better environment. And then the father in the story is also kind of harsh and abusive, but then he says, so when your father called the next morning, just as his own father had always called, promising to go to anger management as your mom wanted, you watched her face deflate. So we can see that this character is not just mean, he's not just abusive, but he's an inexplicable character. So not only does he try to reconcile for his actions at time, he's like at times like a real character would. He's also shaped by life outside of the story. So when we hear about anything, we never really hear anything else about his father again, but this really explains his motives, or at least some part of them. He raises his children poorly because that's how he was raised. Um, so when you're thinking about these characters, it's really important that you kind of keep these aspects in mind, and try to create characters where they can have a life outside of the story. They have things and factors that are shaping them that the reader might not necessarily get to see. But these are characters that ideally you are able to see in your everyday life. Um, so yeah. And then just a quick preview, Stolen will be your homework assignment. And this is a really great story. And when you're reading it specifically, I look for the aspects that we kind of went over today. So show, don't tell, plot, economy, singular concept, and cultivated complexity. So just asking you guys, do you guys have any questions about any of those concepts that we went over so far? Because I know it can be kind of like complicated. No? You guys? Yes? No?
Pretty much.
What did you say? No?
Mhm.
Okay. Perfect. If you have any questions, I know I talk kind of fast maybe, so if you ever have any questions, just feel free to just cut me off and ask me a question. But yeah, so I think this person does a super good job of hitting upon every single one of these points. She's a really awesome writer, and she may or may not have destroyed everyone in a bunch of competitions. I'm just kidding, but she is a very good writer, and she's actually a poet, so this is outside of her scope of what she normally writes, but she still blows it out of the water. Yeah, okay. So now we're going to go into a quick writing exercise that kind of involves everyone's favorite app, Twitter. So, or X, excuse me.
Uh,
Yeah, I don't know. But we're not going to go into kind of what Elon Musk has done, but you may be unhappy or happy to hear that we'll be writing Twitter stories. So these are small 280 character stories, and your goal is essentially to tell a story in 280 characters or less. Um, and there's like this Twitter account that publishes these short stories called the Lickety Split, but I think they went on a hiatus, so I don't know if they still publish them anymore. But if you ever want to publish your story somewhere, you can just let me know and I'll get a bunch of resources for you and I can also help you look them over. But essentially, Twitter stories are 280 character stories. And even though it seems really small, not even 280 words, it's 280 characters, you can see a lot about how people have done a lot with that, right? So the most important aspect of this is economy, right? Making sure each word kind of earns its place, especially since this word count or character count is so small. So you're focusing on one idea and one central theme. Um, so Allie, I guess I have to ask you because Alvin's mic doesn't work, but can you read the first story for us?
okay. Is it intentional that cold and pain are only one tone apart in Cantonese? I don't even know if those are the right characters. I use Google. I had a dream once where you hugged me and said it doesn't have to be cold anymore.
Mhm. Okay, so it's kind of really hard to analyze these small pieces. So let's take a look at the couple of the components. Cold and pain. So that is a connection between cold and pain that is drawn in the very first line, and then it's kind of resolved at the end of the story. So when he said it doesn't have to be cold anymore, you kind of draw a connection between cold and pain. So the dad is kind of saying it doesn't have to be painful anymore. And this could also, based on the implications of what is not said but implied in the story, the dad is not like the kindest dad. And this is like a dream and he dreams of having a kind of a life where he's close to his dad and his dad doesn't says he doesn't have to be in cold or in pain. And then another element is that he asks like, "Oh, this isn't the right character for cold, right? It's not the correct character." I don't know if some of you guys noticed that, but that's deliberate. Because as he says, he doesn't know if those are the right characters, which means he's acknowledging that there's kind of a rift in his culture. So throughout, just through the use of cold and pain, the author conveys that number one, he feels a rift in his identity. He doesn't fully understand the Chinese or Cantonese aspects of his identity. And then number two, he has also a rift in his family. So partially, as the author implied, caused by kind of the rift in the language. And he also feels some sort of pain in the fact that he'll never know his home to the fullest. And then this one, so it takes me hours to remember queso mole. Um, yeah, it takes me hours to remember queso mole. I don't realize they're always there as blue apple eggs, as someone else's hands in milk dough, as a sugar cube, a heartbeat, a clock full of sand, as my past wrapped in tissue paper and fed to a cute bird. Um, so cute bodega cat, sorry. So this is basically saying home is always with you, right? That's the lesson there. The images are always evoking warmth. There's the setup and then there's the twist. So it's really simple. The premise is I don't know it, but I actually do secretly see it. So stories like these can be super simple. It all depends on your own execution. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to write our own Twitter story. So I'll give you a few minutes maybe, um, and make sure that you're writing about one idea. So to make it more specific, I want you to base your Twitter story either on a color, a place, or if you want to kind of take the approach that the first piece does with the language, you can talk about a word in any language of your choosing. So yeah, essentially write a short Twitter story about one of the concepts, or you can pick your own. But those are just some things to go off of. Do you guys have any questions about that? No? Okay, perfect. Um,
I have one.
yeah, what's your question?
Can the story be about anything?
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay. Just try to make sure it's under 280 characters, if you can, which is pretty short, but
I can count.
yeah. You don't have to manually count it though, by the way.
Hmm.
Okay.
Also, where do I get? Where's the docs?
I can send a link in the chat. Okay. And Alvin, you can also write in that doc.